To our presentation. So today our group is going to be talking about Adrienne Rich and Claudia Rankine. So Adrienne Rich and Claudia Rankine have a lot of similarities in terms of they're intrinsically linked through their social commentary and their social awareness and presenting that to the world through their work. And also have a lot of differences too in terms of what subjects they tend to focus on and gravitate towards. So the way we're going to do this presentation is we're going to be initially focusing on the background of both of them, and we're going to talk about their history and what perhaps influenced them into writing in the style that they do. And then we're going to really focus in on their works and their format, and really, what their similarities and differences are. So we're going to start with Adrienne Rich. Rich was born in Baltimore in 1929. She was born to Arnold Rich and Helen Rich. Arnold Rich was a pathologist and Helen was a pianist and a composer as well. And she trained very long and hard for that. But due to her father's opinions, she decided to give that up to become a full-time mother. In her writing, Rich states that her father, brilliant, ambitious, possessed by his own drive, assumed that she would give her life to the enhancement of his. So we're seeing that Rich, from the beginning, really, was noticing these sort of patriarchal standards and the sort of imbalance between men and women. In 1951, she attended Radcliffe College, and in the same year, she was selected by W.H. Auden for the Yale series for younger poets, a series of younger poets for A Change of World. So, A Change of World was more formally written in a sort of metric style, compared to her later works that we're really going to focus on from the 60s and on from that. In 1953, she married Harvard University economist Alfred H. Conrad. They actually later divorced in 1970, and Rich, in fact, later came out as a lesbian. She also had 3 children in the late 50s. Rich was a poet, an essayist, and activist, and she was really renowned for her feminist ideals. But her real sort of politically charged work on like social commentary didn't fully come to fruition until the 60s and beyond that, as I previously mentioned. So a shift in the 60s, this is what we're going to focus on. You'll see here the examples I came up with are all from the 60s and sort of after that. And these are just a few examples of her work that she created. So in the 60s, her work became more socially powered. She wrote about racism, the Vietnam War, and sexism. A lot of these examples are formally about sexism. So we can really see what a big chunk of her focus was on female oppression. Snapshots of a Daughter-in-Law, written in 1963. This specific work was really focused on the patriarchal standards of women, which is something that she quite often visits back to. She talks about oppression and 2 women being pitted against each other under the social ideals of the patriarchy, and that was written in 1963. Planetarium was written in 1968. Planetarium was inspired by Caroline Herschel, who was an astronomer kind of overshadowed by her brother, William Herschel. This sort of refers to the imbalance of, women want to achieve their own things but having to sacrifice others and feeling like, they didn't achieve their really true potential in their life because of the oppression of social norms. Diving into the Wreck in 1973 was kind of an extended metaphor for female vulnerability and oppression as well. And Disloyal to Civilization in 1968 kind of delves into intersectional feminism and sort of focuses on race as well, and about how white women and women of colour are treated differently and how racism fits into that in all kinds of ways of life. And as I kind of touched on before, we do see a good, decent transition of style here from metric to free verse. And I think the free verse is kind of more emblematic of her liberation and feeling expression through her work that she wants other women to feel as well, and other marginalised groups. So Caroline Musk in the New York Times stated she began as a poet and genuine, polite copyist of Yeats and Auden, wife and mother. She progressed in life and in her poems, which remain intimately tied to her life's truth, from young widow to disenchanted formalist, to spiritual and rhetorical convalescent, to female leader, lesbian separatist, and Diane of newly defined female literature. So I think that really sums up the points that I've been saying here. Her transition from her initial work in the 50s and, becoming more true to herself, and that's really reflected through her work as well. Her This situation, rejecting awards, is something that I feel is really emblematic of her activism throughout her life, because she enacted her activism throughout all kind of walks of life, as well as just through her work. So Adrienne Rich was among 12 recipients of the National Medal of Arts Award, but in a letter to the White House, she rejected it. You can actually read this whole letter, but I've just taken this section of it, which I think just really shows um, who she is to the core of her person. She writes, I cannot accept such an award from President Clinton or this White House because the very meaning of art, as I understand it, is incompatible with the cynical politics of this administration. So, like I said before, I think this really just summed up her level of activism throughout her whole life. And I just wanted to finish Rich's background on this quote that she said, which I feel really sums her up just very nicely. She says, those who speak largely of the human condition are usually those most exempt from its oppression, whether of sex, race, or servitude. So, yeah, and now we'll be moving on to Rankine.
And I'm going to do this by talking first about her background. So she was born on January 1st in 1963 in Kingston, Jamaica, and she migrated with her parents to New York City when she was 7. She earned a BA from Williams College in 1986 and an MFA, a Master of Fine Arts in Poetry in Columbia in 1993. And during her academic career, Rankine taught literature and creative writing at a number of university institutions, these being University of Georgia, Houston, and even joined the faculty at Yale University. An interesting linking between both poets is Rankine being influenced by Rich's poetry and work, and gives her credit for giving her confidence to address social issues from a personal position. So these are a list of Rankine's poetry and works, and she has published many. Her collections are Just Us, An American Conversation, Citizen, An American Lyric, and Nothing in Nature is Private. So with the publication in 1994 of her debut collection of poems Nothing in Nature is Private, Rankine emerged as an innovative, proactive voice in contemporary poetry. She was an artist whose work reflects a moral vision that she supports, which condemns racism and perpetuated the call for social justice, and also her work has the means to be vivid and new. There are a lot of achievements that Rankine has achieved in her working life. One being, which is I think the most important, the founding of the Racial Imaginary Institute. In 2013, Rankine was elected as the Chancellor for the Academy of American Poets, and also in the following year she then published Citizen, which is a compelling chronicle of racial aggression and the continuum of violence in the US. For that work, Rankine received both a PEN Open Book Award program intending to foster racial and ethnic diversity within the literacy and publishing industry and community. Rankine was also awarded the NAACP, which is the National Association for the Advancement of Coloured People Imagery Award for poetry in 2015, and she was a finalist in the National Book Awards and was also the winner of the National Book Critics Circle Awards for poetry. What does Rankine really want to achieve in her poetry? What her influences? The most important being to be able to speak out about actions and expressions. She wants people to speak out about the microaggressions and the racism that Black people face. And this is the reason why she even wrote Citizen, and this is a collection of other people's experiences coming together, and she writes them to shine a light and hope her readers have an understanding and can either relate to the situations that she says, or it opens their eyes into what people are facing. In this 2016 interview, she places a huge importance on self-loss. Not only do we lose ourselves and others when we are speaking silent or when we stay silent and we don't speak to these microaggressive acts, but we lose our sense of identity and every time we stay silent. And so Rankin also discusses how America has mourned, white supremacist terrorist behavior. However, how are we supposed to really sort out the issue of feeling grief, loss, and guilt when we haven't really sorted out the reason or the issue of why we feel these feelings? And so Rankin places a lot of importance on opening up about racism and standing up. Not only are we standing up for ourselves, but standing up for a whole race of people who have had a very horrible history and who still are experiencing trauma since that and are still being treated differently because of the colour of the skin, which is an issue that should have been dismissed a long time ago, really. Um, Not only does she talk about that, but she talks about how these microaggressive acts can really lead to serious outcomes and circumstances. For example, police brutality, which is another theme that she really does explore in Citizen. And this quote, which was taken from the interview, really sums up who Rankin is as an author and who she is as a poet, an author, person, and what she really wants us to understand after reading her poetry. So silence lines up with acceptance. If I don't speak out, who knows that I feel like a moment or action.
And how they compare and contrast in this respect. So to begin with, Rankine and Rich. At the beginning of her career, she was very influenced by the traditional poets, and this can really be seen in her first collections because of how she was her upbringing and how she was taught to write. But that changed over her life and her poetry, her writing career. And Correts writes, she realizes that her own voice can be articulated in forms that seem to be more adequate to her primary concerns with the relationship of the individual with language and with society, and of women in this context, all encompassed in her search for a meaningful connection between word and world, woman and patriarchy. As she went on from using traditional forms of poetry and included more political content. And when she kind of commented on her earlier work, she said, in many cases, I had suppressed, omitted, falsified, even certain disturbing elements to gain that perfection of order. And when you contrast a poem from my early collection, so for example, for the conjunction of two planets, which is from the 1951, it has a very strict rhyme scheme. It follows a very rigid structure. Whilst comparing to her later poems, such as 21 Love Poems, she doesn't follow that. She uses her own form of the sonnet, and it is a sonnet, but this collection defies the structure of sonnet, which is usually associated with typical heterosexual white men, such as Shakespeare, who is very well known for writing sonnets. And similarly, her poetry focuses heavily on women, the relationships between women, and that is significant in the context of her own lifetime. And then moving on to Claudia Rankine, her form is also very different from the very typical. In her book Citizen, an American Lyric, she defies normal poetic structure. She basically uses prose poetry, and although it does maintain a lyrical quality, it is not a typical lyric. And there's also the second person narrative, which holds the reader accountable, especially readers who are not Black Americans, who don't have to deal with the microaggressive actions and words that is represented in her poetry. And Chan said that Rankin's own work emerges out of a critical awareness of the need to refashion the lyric in response to the tribulations of being a Black citizen in contemporary America. She also uses visual aids, which is very significant in her poetry. And in an interview with the White Review, she said, when you're in this realm of talking about relationships between people of different races, so much of it is triggered by what you see. And this is particularly significant to her poetry, as it's very... it allows for there to be visual aspects and to be much more harrowing, and to really make the reader think. And like an example of this is her image from, she uses an image from the artist Kate Clark, who superimposes like people's faces on animals, and in this instance she imposed the face of a young black girl onto the body of a caribou, which is staring directly at the reader, and it makes it so much more disturbing, especially as it is an animal who is prey. And also with form, Chan wrote, in Citizen, Rankine eschews the use of rhyme and enjambment for a plainer and more prosaic form of lyricism that embodies a search for a form adequate to convey the particularities of trauma caused by systemic racism in contemporary America. So with their similarities, compare and contrast them, they both go against typical form of poetry, whether that be through the changing of sonnets or not having typical lyrics, and also using different formats, such as with Rankine. They also both use their distancing from traditional poetry to do towards the political undertones of their poetry. But they do maintain some forms of convention. There is the sonnet, there is the lyric. The prose poetry has been used by authors, like French authors, for years. And then lastly, they are both distancing themselves from the poetry of what's traditional from white heterosexual men in order to replicate experiences of being in a society that is against you and oppresses you, and whether that be your race, your sexuality, or your gender. And then their differences. The most obvious difference for both poets is the form they write in. Rankine uses prose poetry and lyrics, and Rich is more focused on sonnets. And then they replicate very, very different ideas. Although they both have the political message, they're very, very different ideas, and they contrast with each other, despite having some unity. And then lastly, Rankine plays with form a lot more. Although Rich does not keep to a very traditional form in terms of sonnets, Rankine definitely plays with form a lot more in terms of including artwork, and including different forms of poetry. She has a poem in with a list of names of black people who have been killed due to police brutality, and it's an unfinished poem, and things like that. It's a lot more different to the poetry that Rich writes, which is still a poem, and it still appears
within
like
the work of Rich and Rankine. And I hope to do this by focusing on 4 key concepts and themes: inequality, invisibility and hypervisibility, the notion of the other, history, erasure and change. So firstly, inequality. So although both poets discuss inequality within their work, the approach they take significantly differs. Rankine focuses on racial inequalities, whereas Rich places a greater emphasis on gender and sexual inequalities. Yet despite this difference, both poets deem the existence of a patriarchal white world to be the cause of oppression and inequality, and in doing so they draw links to the notion of the other, a term coined by Homi K. Bhabha, which equates white men with perfection, and the other, so in the case of Rankine, black people, or in Rich's case women, to be slaves of their biology and appearance, and this links to that of a third-party consciousness. So for a bit of close analysis, Rankine highlights, because white men can't police their imagination, black people are dying. This is of course ironic, as typically black people tend to be policed more, yet Rankine comments on the notion that this is absolutely ludicrous, as a problem lies within white people and white people's perception of blackness rather than blackness itself. Similarly, when discussing racial inequalities, Rankine does not just analyse black victimhood, but she also concentrates on the construction of whiteness, as she highlights that whiteness is ingrained in society so much it's invisible to the extent that whiteness demands explanation. This parallels the work of Frantz Fanon and his ideologies within the fact of blackness, as Fanon highlights that black people are othered to the extent that they're slaves of their appearance, they're black-faced and then human. This links to that of a third-party consciousness, as it shows that Black people are viewed through the lens of white people, and this is the only lens where they're perceived. It just shows that they're denied any opportunity to create an identity for themselves, as white people have already constructed that identity. This links to the work of Rich, as Rich highlights women have been driven mad, gaslighted for centuries by the refutation of our experience and our instincts in the culture which validates only male experience. This, of course, parallels the work of Simone de Beauvoir within The Second Sex, where he highlights that women are deemed as the other, as inferior and substandard to that of men. The fact that women have been driven mad, gaslighted for centuries, again links to that of a third-party consciousness, as it shows that women are viewed through the lens of men, and the fact that the culture validates only male experience shows that femininity and feminine experience and culture is deemed as substandard to that of men. However, Rankine emphasises that Blackness is not only deemed as inferior, foreign, secondary, or substandard, but it is instead perceived to be incomprehensible and threatening to the workings of society. It is almost hated. Rankine emphasises in Citizen, you never really speak except for the time she makes a request, and later she tells you smell good and that features more like a white person. You assume she thinks she is thanking you for letting her cheat, and feels better cheating from an almost white person. The fact that she tells you smell good and have features more like a white person parallels the work of Fanon and his views on ontology, as Fanon highlights that ontology does not permit us to understand the being of the Black man. Similarly, Rankine just shows that it's the speaker or the protagonist within the poem is unable to comprehend the features of the Black protagonist. Similarly, the fact that she feels better if cheated from an almost white person links to the notion of invisibility and hypervisibility, which essentially stresses that whiteness is deemed as transparent, invisible, and social norm to those who are white, whereas it makes itself hypervisible to those who are Black. So Blackness has to be discovered both by Black people and white people, and it's thus in a sense deemed as unauthentic within the patriarchal white world. It also emphasizes that Blackness isn't just deemed to be substandard or isn't just othered, but it's hated not just by one person, by a neighbor or a friend, but by your whole race, and this just shows the irrationality of racial inequalities as a whole. Rankine, Rich, and Change. So both poets call for a drastic change to be made within society. For Rankine, change is equality, and for Rich, change is the reconstitution of the world. However, Rankine acknowledges that for Black people, change is almost unattainable. This is because she recognises that Black people are not welcome in the sphere which enables change or even treatment. As within Citizen, she recounts a tale where the new therapist specialises in trauma counselling. You've only ever spoken on the phone. When the door finally opens, the woman standing there yells at the top of her lungs, "Get away from my house." This again just emphasises the unreasoned hate towards Black people and how they're unable to call for change when there's no place for their voice to be heard. Even upon you hear it, it's just considered as noise. She also highlights the notion of fixity and how change is almost impossible, as throughout the latter part of A Citizen, she writes, in memory of Jordan Russell Davis, in memory of Eric Garner, in memory of John Crawford, in memory of Michael Brown, in memory of Jordan. Following this, there's dozens of names, and towards the end of the poem, the names start to fade, and it just starts to end with in memory of. This highlights that the list may keep going on and on and on, yet the change will never occur. It's almost as if it's a continuous cycle. See George Floyd for a modern day example. That change is an immense step away for Black people, and we need to work hard to obtain this. Rich and Change. So for Rich, change is possible, and to the extent that Rich aims to create a new kind of human being, envisioning a post-androgynous world. She highlights within the dreams of a common language. With no extraordinary power, we constitute the world. No one has imagined us. We want to live like trees. Therefore, for Claire Keyes, Rich is concerned with the new being of a woman who has complete potency. However, Rich is often critiqued, and Helen Bendler critiques Rich for denying the significance of men. Similarly, Rich just shows the extent of male oppression and how much she detests it. As she highlights, I am crying helplessly and I still control the world. We still have to stare into the absence of men who would not, women who could not speak. This still unexcavated whole called civilization, this act of translation, this half world. This just shows her desire for change, as she deems inequality for men and women to be a half world, and in order for the world to be complete and full, a new kind of woman has to be born, a woman with full potency and power.
Poetry. And in conclusion, they are both majorly influential poets who use their platforms to share political messages and to, have a voice for a particular set of people, whether that be, Rankine talking about race and, really showing what it's like to experience microaggressions, or for Rich to show what it was like being a lesbian woman, particularly in like her collections from like 1970s, 1980s, where it was a very, very different attitude. And then, Rankine focuses on race and the experience of Black Americans who have to suffer with everyday racism. And her Poetry and Citizen replicates the experience and provides a first-hand view of these experiences, especially because they are from people's actual stories. And then similarly, Rich uses her poetry to highlight the difficulties of being lesbian and being a woman, particularly during a time where it was a lot less accepted than it is now. And both poets use form and a variety of themes to exemplify their messages, and that can be seen throughout the work as discussed in our presentation. Thank you for listening.